Hey guys, tonight we're sliding silently through a damp veil of morning fog, the kind that makes the edges of the world feel soft and uncertain. The water beneath you is almost still, broken only by the faint ripples trailing from your canoe's bow. Somewhere in the distance, a paddle dips and pulls, the gentle splash echoing across what seems like an endless maze of canals. The smell is a strange mix of fresh greenery and lake water, tinged with the faint, earthy musk of wet reeds. Somewhere nearby, you hear the quiet rustle of someone harvesting lettuce. You pull your blanket tighter, not that it will save you from the damp air that creeps in from every direction. Truth be told, if you were actually here in the 15th century without knowing what you were doing, you probably wouldn't survive this morning. And that's before we even talk about the crocodiles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fog swirls low over the water as you glide deeper into the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. Historians still argue whether mornings like this were truly silent or filled with the low chatter of early risers, but in your little stretch of canal, the world feels hushed, as if everyone is holding their breath. Ahead, a flat-bottomed canoe emerges from the mist, stacked high with green shoots tied in neat bundles. The gardener's paddle strokes are slow, deliberate, and you can tell by the way he shifts his weight that this is muscle memory built over decades. The canals themselves are alive. Fish dart beneath the surface, sometimes flashing silver in the weak light. Tiny bubbles rise from the mud below, hinting at unseen life wriggling in the sediment. You pass the dark shape of a cormorant, wings spread wide to dry, perched on a half-submerged log. The air carries a quiet hum of productivity. Somewhere, a woman in another canoe is scooping water into a clay jar, the liquid sloshing against the rim. A child crouches in a shallow boat, trailing a net behind him, trying to scoop up whatever the lake decides to offer this morning. The city itself, if you can call it that, feels less like a collection of streets and buildings, and more like an elaborate aquatic organism. The chinampas, those floating gardens, stretch in orderly green rectangles, each surrounded by narrow waterways. From a distance, it's like a patchwork quilt, but each patch is alive, tended by human hands that know every root and reed. The smell of wood smoke drifts faintly from somewhere inland, where families are already heating tortillas for breakfast. You catch yourself thinking about how many thousands of people live here, sustained by these canals and gardens, and yet how calm it feels in this moment. Maybe it's because you're not in the heart of the marketplace, or maybe it's because the fog dulls the sound like a soft blanket. Your guide, an older man with deep lines around his eyes, doesn't speak much. Every so often he nods toward something. A stand of willows where an egret stalks for fish. A mound of reeds where turtles might be hiding. A cluster of tiny white flowers blooming from a floating mat of plants. He's seen this 1,000 times, but there's still a kind of pride in the way he points them out. There's a rhythm to this place. Paddle forward, pause, let the water settle. The sound of the paddle dipping in and out becomes almost hypnotic. You start to notice the details. The thin ropes tied from tree to tree. The faint glisten of dew on maize leaves. The occasional splash as a fish breaks the surface. Somewhere in the fog, a voice calls out, sharp, carrying over the water, and another answers. It's not alarm, just the morning roll call between gardeners who are already knee-deep in their day's work. You imagine they're swapping notes about where the best mud is today, or maybe teasing each other about yesterday's haul. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. Some accounts suggest gardeners here use little floating rafts to start seedlings before transplanting them into the chinampas. It's like ancient hydroponics, except with more mud and fewer Instagram influencers. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or just an occasional trick for more delicate plants. But the idea of tiny baby gardens floating among the big gardens feels charming in its own way. The sun finally begins to push through, turning the mist into a glowing haze. Golden light brushes the tops of the reeds, and the green of the plants deepens. The paddler ahead of you pauses, turns his head just slightly, and you catch the glint of sunlight on his cheek. Then he pushes forward again, his canoe rocking gently with each stroke. You drift past a narrow strip of land where a woman is kneeling, her hands buried wrist-deep in dark, wet soil. She hums softly, a tune you don't recognize, and each time she shifts her weight, you can hear the mud squelch. Behind her, a small dog trots along the edge of the Chinampa, tail high, ears twitching at every ripple in the water. And then you notice the faint outlines of more canoes approaching, their shapes dark against the brightening mist. They're stacked with different greens, some taller, some trailing vines, some with tiny blossoms. It's the morning commute, Aztec style. No honking, no exhaust fumes, just the quiet determination of people who know exactly where they're going and exactly why they're up this early. As the fog lifts higher, you can see the distant shapes of temples rising above the city center, their stepped silhouettes stark against the soft sky. It's a reminder that while these gardens feed the body, the city also feeds something deeper. Rituals, ceremonies, and a whole world view tied to the cycles of nature. You'll get closer to that soon enough. But for now, the slow drift through these living waters feels like enough. The guide shifts his paddle, turning you toward a narrower canal. The air is warmer here, the plants on either side taller, almost arching overhead to create a green tunnel. You breathe in the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves, and for a moment, it feels like the entire world is nothing but water, plants, and the quiet movement of people who've been here far longer than your imagination can stretch. Somewhere ahead, there's the sound of someone laughing, quick, sharp, and gone in a heartbeat. Maybe they're already telling jokes about the day's work, or maybe, just maybe, they've spotted a crocodile and decided not to tell you. You round a bend in the narrow canal, and the water opens into a broader, sunlit space. The mist is almost gone now, burned away by a steady warmth that spreads over the Chinampas. The air smells sharper here. Cut grass, crushed leaves, and the faint, briny scent of lake water lapping against reed walls. You drift closer to a rectangular plot. The edges so perfectly straight, they almost seem carved by a giant ruler. But there's no stone or brick here, just woven reeds, anchored by thick stakes driven deep into the lake bed. Your guide taps his paddle against the edge of the nearest Chinampa, the dull thud echoing in the hollow framework. This one is new, its sides still bright with fresh-cut willow poles. You watch two men wade waist-deep in the water, pressing bundles of reeds into place between the stakes. The bundles swell slightly as they soak, wedging themselves tighter. It's like they're building a floating box, and the lake itself is helping hold it together. One of the men looks up, grinning at you as if to say, "Yes, it's as hard as it looks." He scoops up a dripping clump of vegetation from the shallows, water hyacinth perhaps, and stuffs it into the base. This isn't random. The plants will rot down, forming a spongy, fertile layer that will both feed crops and keep the whole platform afloat. Historians still argue whether the very first Chinampas were anchored to the shorelines or built fully free-floating in open water. Either way, the version you're watching is firmly tethered with poles driven into the mud. It's not going anywhere without a fight. Your guide tells you almost offhandedly that building a Chinampa isn't a quick job. It can take weeks, sometimes months, to get the layers just right. First, you set the stakes in a neat rectangle. Then you weave between them with pliant willow branches, a slow, careful process that feels half like gardening and half like basket making on a grand scale. Then comes the real magic, the filling. Workers paddle out to the shallow parts of the lake, where the mud is richest, and scoop it up in long-handled baskets. It's heavy, wet, and more valuable than gold here. They pile it between the woven walls, alternating it with layers of rotting vegetation. Over time, the mass compresses, the water drains, and you end up with a rich, spongy soil that's practically begging for seeds. A quirky detail catches your eye. Near the edge of one platform, someone has tucked a few flowering plants into the gaps. Maybe they're just pretty, or maybe they're a clever way to lure pollinators to the vegetables that will grow here later. There's no wasted space. Every corner has a purpose. You watch a younger boy waiting nearby, his small hands pushing extra reeds into gaps where water seeps through. He's humming something tuneless, completely focused on his task. The older men don't correct him. They just let him work. Here, skill is learned slowly, by doing. At one point, a canoe glides past carrying more building materials. Bundles of reeds stacked so high you can barely see the paddler. He maneuvers effortlessly around your boat, dipping his paddle in quick, shallow strokes to keep his load steady. No one shouts instructions. No one waves traffic through. Everyone just seems to know the unspoken choreography of the canals. Your guide leans toward you, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. They say a chinampa can last decades if you care for it. But you have to keep feeding it. More mud, more plants, more time. You can't help but think of it like sourdough starter. Keep it alive and it will keep feeding you. Off to one side, a group of women are working on a nearly finished chinampa. They're leveling the top, using flat wooden boards to scrape the soil into smooth, even layers. Every so often, one straightens up, stretches her back, and glances toward the water as if checking for something. You follow her gaze, but see only the soft ripples of a passing duck. The sun climbs higher, and the smell of warm mud thickens in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker starts a rhythmic tapping on a hollow pole, the sound oddly in sync with the slap of wet reeds against the chinampa wall. There's a certain satisfaction in seeing something take shape from nothing more than plants, mud, and human persistence. Modern construction might use steel and concrete, but here the materials grow from the lake itself. And unlike modern buildings, the chinampa is alive in its own way. Its walls are living willows that will root and strengthen over time. Your guide gestures toward one particularly straight-backed man who is driving in a fresh stake. That one's been doing this for 40 years, he says. When he was young, he could finish a chinampa in 2 weeks. Now he takes his time. You can see why. Every strike of his mallet is deliberate, each reed placed just so. He's not racing anyone. He's building something that will outlast him. As you drift closer, you notice how the water line sits just below the top of the woven wall. The whole platform seems impossibly buoyant, even with the weight of all that mud. You wonder how it will feel once it's covered in corn and beans, the green mass swaying slightly with each breeze. Another quirky fact comes to mind. Some sources claim that in the earliest days, gardeners would sometimes throw festivals when a chinampa was finished, inviting neighbors to help plant the first seeds. Whether that's true or just a romanticized story, you can easily imagine it. Music echoing across the canals, canoes crowding the edges, everyone eager to see what would grow. By now, your guide has looped the canoe around the far end of the new chinampa. You get a close-up look at the living willow poles, their bark damp and shining. Tiny buds are already sprouting along their sides, proof that in a few weeks these stakes will be more than anchors. They'll be trees, their roots binding the walls even tighter. As you watch the workers pause to drink from clay jugs, you realize there's no real separation here between building and farming. A chinampa isn't just a field you plant. It's a living partner that needs to be raised, tended, and in a way, loved. You think about your own potted plants at home and wonder if you've ever shown them the same level of commitment. The work continues without pause, the sound of paddles, voices, and the occasional splash filling the warm air. Somewhere behind you, another crew is starting on their own rectangle of stakes and reeds. The city grows one floating garden at a time, each one anchored in mud, patience, and the quiet certainty that food will come. The day has settled into that late morning brightness, where the light glances off the water like spilled silver, and every movement is sharper. Your canoe nudges into a side canal, narrower and shallower than before. The air here is thick with the smell of warm mud, heavy, mineral-rich, and just a little sour in a way that tells you life is brewing in it. This, your guide murmurs, is where the best silt lives, the kind that makes Chinampa soil legendary. Two gardeners are already at work. They stand in their flat-bottomed canoe, balanced like tightrope walkers, each holding a long, flat basket with rope handles. One dips his basket straight down into the water, submerging it into the soft lake bed. There's a faint sucking sound as he pulls it back up, the basket dripping black sludge. The mud looks almost alive, shiny, thick, with a faint shimmer where the sunlight catches bits of crushed shells. They tip the mud into the bottom of their canoe, where it piles like wet bread dough. You can practically feel its weight just from watching. It's a slow process. Lower, scoop, lift, tip. Again and again. The rhythm is hypnotic, a mix between farming and mining, except their gold is dark, messy, and smells faintly of fish. Historians still argue whether this lake bed muck was just rich in nutrients because of decayed plant matter, or whether centuries of fish droppings, bird waste, and decomposed algae gave it a unique, almost magical fertility. Either way, the gardeners treat it like treasure. Your guide dips his own paddle into the water and stirs up a cloud of fine silt that billows outward like smoke underwater. It's so fine it seems to vanish within seconds, but you can imagine how much of it settles slowly onto the lake floor over time. A quirky tidbit you remember. Some accounts claim that the Aztecs believed this mud could revive exhausted land, even on the mainland. Farmers would sometimes ferry it to distant fields, hauling canoe after canoe until the soil was reborn. Whether it was mystical thinking or just solid agronomy, it worked. And in a world where bad harvests could mean famine, this stuff was priceless. One of the gardeners laughs as he hoists up a particularly big scoop, nearly losing his balance when it sticks to the basket. The other teases him in rapid Nahuatl, and although you don't understand the words, you can tell it's the kind of friendly ribbing you'd hear at any job site in any century. Their canoe is already half full, and you notice the way they've lined the bottom with reeds. It's not just to keep the mud from sloshing, it's so the water can drain off slowly, leaving behind the dense, nutrient-rich core they want. When they're done, they'll paddle back to the Chinampas, spreading the mud in an even layer to feed the plants. Your guide tells you that mud gathering is an art as much as a chore. Too shallow, and you get gritty sand. Too deep, and you hit sticky clay that holds water, but chokes roots. The best silt has the texture of a thick custard, and smells faintly of fresh rain mixed with moss. You make a mental note to never complain about potting soil again. A flock of ducks splashes down nearby, paddling in a lazy circle. One dips its head under and comes up with a wriggling something in its beak. The gardeners don't mind. The ducks churn up the water, loosening more silt, which will settle where they can scoop it later. Nature here doesn't just coexist with farming, it pitches in, whether it knows it or not. You lean over the side of the canoe and trail your fingers through the water. The mud below feels soft and yielding, almost like kneading dough. A thin film of green algae slides over your skin, cool in the heat of the sun. Somewhere deep down, this is exactly the same texture people here have been feeling for hundreds of years. One of the gardeners gestures toward a darker patch in the water, explaining that certain areas collect richer silt after storms. The currents bring in debris, the plants rot, and the mud becomes thick with nutrients. There's a quiet satisfaction in his voice, the pride of someone who knows his craft inside out. You watch as they finish loading their canoe, the mound of mud glistening like obsidian in the sunlight. The boat rides lower now, wobbling slightly with each movement. They climb in carefully, pushing off with long poles, and begin the slow trip back toward the gardens. Every so often, one leans down to scoop up a bit more from the shallows, as if unable to resist topping up the load. Another quirky detail your guide drops in. Some gardeners swore by a rest period for their mud piles, letting the silt sit for a few days before spreading it, so it would cool down. Modern soil scientists might call that letting microbes settle, but back then it was just common sense passed from one muddy hand to another. The air grows warmer as the sun climbs higher, and the smell of wet earth seems to coat your skin. You pass a finished chinampa, where two women are spreading fresh mud in thin, careful layers, their bare feet sinking slightly as they move. They laugh together, occasionally flicking bits of mud at each other like mischievous children. Farming here is serious work, but no one has banned a little fun. The canal narrows again, and your canoe glides into the shade of overhanging willows. Their roots trail in the water, catching bits of floating debris, leaves, twigs, even the occasional feather. You spot a turtle basking on a submerged log, head tilted toward the sun, utterly uninterested in your passing. Somewhere behind you, the gardener's laughter fades, replaced by the soft drip of water from your paddle. You glance down one last time at the lakebed mud, now just a mottled shadow beneath the rippling surface, and it's hard not to think of it as a kind of underwater gold mine, one that's fed a city for centuries without ever running dry. The willows appear first as thin green silhouettes, their branches trailing like hair into the water. Your canoe drifts closer, and you notice how deliberate their placement is. Not random trees growing wherever they please, but a living wall planted exactly where it's needed. The roots twist down into the lakebed, gripping mud and woven reeds, while the flexible branches weave naturally into the chinampa's framework. Two men are already there, standing ankle-deep in the water, bending the branches of a young willow toward each other. Their fingers are quick, wrapping the supple stems around each other in tight spirals. It's like watching someone braid hair, except here, the hair will harden into a fence that's alive, self-repairing and, given time, nearly indestructible. Your guide explains that the willows aren't just for looks. They hold the chinampa's shape, their roots binding the edge to prevent erosion. Historians still argue whether this technique was developed purely for function, or if it also carried symbolic meaning. Willows were associated with water and fertility, so perhaps each woven fence was as much an offering as it was engineering. You reach out and touch one of the younger trunks. The bark is smooth and cool, the kind of surface you instinctively want to run your fingers along. In a few seasons it will be rough, deeply lined, and resistant to just about anything short of an axe. A quirky tidbit bubbles up in your mind. In some Aztec neighborhoods, these willow fences doubled as property markers. If a dispute broke out over where one chinampa ended and another began, the line of living trees was the final word. Move the fence, and everyone would notice. Trees aren't exactly subtle. One of the men pauses his weaving to swat at a mosquito. You can hear his companion chuckle and say something in Nahuatl that probably translates to, "It's your blood they like, not mine." Then he goes right back to bending and knotting the branches. The knots aren't tied with rope. They're simply twisted together in a way that will hold until the branches thicken and fuse. It's slow work, but they don't seem rushed. Every few minutes, one steps back to look at the curve of the fence, adjusting the angle of a branch so it grows in just the right direction. There's an artistry here that you wouldn't expect from what's essentially a mud-retaining wall. As your canoe drifts along the edge, you see fences at different stages of life. The newest are pale and flexible, the branches still soft enough to bend in your hand. The oldest ones are gnarled, thick, and dense, with roots like knotted fists plunging into the water. Birds perch in their branches, and fish dart between the submerged roots, using them as shelter. It's a reminder that every chinampa edge is more than a boundary. It's an ecosystem. Your guide leans over and plucks a small willow shoot from the water, explaining how easy it is to propagate. Just cut a branch, stick it into the mud, and it will root and grow. You think of modern garden centers selling overpriced saplings in plastic pots and feel a little cheated. In one corner, a group of children is helping to weave. Their hands are smaller, their movements less practiced, but they're learning. An older woman supervised, correcting a twist here, tightening a loop there. You notice she's smiling, not scolding. The fence will hold, and the kids will remember how to make it better next time. A breeze stirs and the willow leaves whisper against each other, making a sound like soft rain. The air here is cooler, filtered through the leaves, and you can see why someone might choose to sit in this spot on a hot afternoon. There's a moment where your canoe glides alongside a fence so tall it blocks your view of the garden behind it. You feel a little like a nosy neighbor, craning your neck to catch glimpses of maize stalks and flowering beans through gaps in the branches. Another quirky fact your guide mentions. In the dry season, when water levels dropped, gardeners sometimes harvested willow branches for baskets, mats, and even temporary roofing. The fence didn't suffer. They'd grow back thicker the next season. It's the kind of renewable resource that makes you wonder why more modern farming doesn't copy the idea. The men finish a section and step back into their canoe. They paddle along, scanning for spots that need patching. Every so often they stop, wedge the canoe against the fence, and tuck in another branch. The work seems endless, but not unpleasant. More like tending a beloved hedge than repairing a wall. As the sun shifts, you notice the play of light through the leaves. The water below reflects dappled gold and green patterns, and for a moment, it feels like you're floating inside a living cathedral. The air smells faintly sweet from the willow sap, blending with the ever-present scent of lake water and wet soil. In the distance, you hear the sound of a mallet striking a stake, someone else starting a new chinampa frame. It's a reminder that every fence you see here began the same way. Bare poles driven into the mud, given time and care until they became unbreakable. Your guide points out one last detail before you drift on. A tiny nest tucked into the crook of 2 willow branches, no bigger than your palm. Inside, 3 speckled eggs rest, unmoving but warm in the sun. The fence isn't just holding in mud. It's holding up life in ways its builders may not even think about. You leave the willows behind, their green walls swaying gently in the breeze, and the canal opens up again. Ahead you can see gardeners bending over neat rows of seedlings, their backs to the water, hands moving in quick, practiced motions. The floating farm is ready for its next chapter. The canal widens until it feels almost like a narrow lake, and on either side the chinampas are awake with activity. You drift closer to one, drawn by the sight of farmers crouched low to the soil, moving with that quick, confident rhythm that comes from doing the same thing every day for years. Their hands are dark with earth, fingers calloused, nails caked with the black silt you saw being mined earlier. They're planting in rows so straight they look drawn with a ruler. Maize in the center, always maize, its seedlings spaced with uncanny precision, like they already know how tall each will grow and how much room the leaves will need to stretch. Between the maize, beans have been placed to climb the stalks once they're strong enough, and at the edges, low squash plants are being tucked into place, their broad leaves destined to shade the soil and keep it from drying out. It's the Mesoamerican Three Sisters system, a farming trick so efficient you almost expect it to have its own fan club. One farmer pauses to wipe his brow, then grins at you and waves with the hand still clutching a seedling. He's not in any hurry. This isn't a race. You notice how often the workers pause to check the soil, pressing it between their fingers, then adjusting the way they place each plant. Historians still argue whether all chinampas followed this neat triple crop layout, or if some specialized in single crops for market demand, rows and rows of chili peppers, for example, or nothing but amaranth for making ritual dough. But here, at least, the variety is obvious and intentional. A quirky little detail catches your eye. At the far corner of the plot, a woman plants something that clearly isn't food, a cluster of bright marigolds. Your guide tells you they're for warding off pests, but also for offerings later. In a place where farming, religion, and daily life are woven together like willow branches, you can never assume one purpose is enough. The farmer's tools are simple: wooden digging sticks, flat hand spades, and sometimes just fingers. No one seems to mind getting dirty. The black silt clings to their skin like ink. The planting itself is almost ceremonial. Press, tuck, cover, pat. Each motion repeated in a quiet rhythm that lulls you into watching without thinking. Your canoe drifts along the edge, close enough to hear their chatter. It's light, teasing conversation. Someone jokes about last year's squash that grew so big it cracked a canoe. Another brags about having the sweetest beans in the market. It's the kind of banter that keeps a slow morning moving. At one point, a young boy runs down the narrow strip between two chinampas, carrying a bundle of seedlings in both arms. He hops across a tiny wooden plank bridge like it's nothing, balancing perfectly even as the plank sways. Behind him, a dog trots along, tail wagging, occasionally dipping its nose into the neat rows, as if checking the planting work. Your guide explains that the neatness isn't just for looks. Straight rows make it easier to weed, water, and harvest. They also help with canal access. Each row is positioned so that when the plants are ready, you can glide a canoe alongside and load up without trampling the crops. Efficiency here is centuries ahead of its time. In the heat of the late morning, you catch the faint scent of crushed bean leaves, mingling with the earthy smell of squash vines just starting to spread. Every so often a breeze ripples through, carrying with it the sharper, spicier hint of chili plants, growing a few chinampas over. You imagine how all these scents would mingle in the market later, a sensory overload in the best way. A farmer near the water's edge pauses to scoop up a handful of lake water in a gourd and sprinkle it over the youngest plants. There's no elaborate irrigation system here, just the constant ready supply of the canal. You realize how perfectly designed this whole floating world is. Mud for soil, water on all sides, living fences, and crops that seem to know exactly how to help each other grow. Another quirky tidbit from your guide. Some farmers like to train their maize by brushing the seedlings gently with willow branches in the windless mornings. Supposedly, it made them sturdier, less likely to snap in a storm. Whether it was science or superstition, the farmers swore by it, and you can see one in the distance doing exactly that, the soft swish of leaves marking each pass. The sunlight shifts again, catching on the tips of maize leaves and making the water between chinampas sparkle. A dragonfly hovers just above the beans, its iridescent wings flickering like stained glass before darting away. A frog croaks from somewhere close, its voice deep and lazy. You notice how the farmers always plant a little extra, more seedlings than they strictly need. Your guide says it's insurance against pests, disease, or the occasional duck who decides that tender maize shoots are a free buffet. It's not waste, it's preparation. One older man finishes a row and sits back on his heels, surveying his work. He nods once, satisfied, then starts the next row without looking up. You can almost feel the years in his movements. He's planted this way so many times that his body could do it in the dark. The canoe glides past the far edge of the chinampa, where the marigolds catch the sun in a blaze of orange and gold. Beyond them, the water opens into another canal, already busy with boats carrying baskets of seedlings to other gardens. The city feels like it's breathing, mud in, crops out, everything in motion. And somewhere, in the center of this patchwork, someone is already thinking about the harvest, months before the first ear of maize is even formed. The canal bends gently, and the rhythm of planting fades into a new kind of bustle. Here the waterway narrows between two lines of chinampas so close you could almost step from one to the other. if you didn't mind a plunge into the dark water when you inevitably misjudged the distance. On one side, a canoe is pulled up against the bank, its flat bottom resting half in the mud, half afloat. Two men kneel inside, sorting through bundles of freshly cut reeds stacked so high they hide the boat's bow. These reeds aren't for weaving baskets or mats, at least not today. Instead, they'll form the skeletal base for a new chinampa. You watch as the men lash them into thick, springy mats with thin willow twine. The work looks deceptively simple, but every piece is measured by eye and layered with care. Too loose, and the whole platform will sag and twist. Too tight, and it won't flex with the water's movement, which means it might split when the first heavy rain comes. Your guide points ahead, and you see the new garden taking shape just beyond the bend. 4 men stand ankle-deep in water, driving sharpened wooden stakes into the lake bed in a perfect rectangle. These will anchor the chinampa's frame, marking out the boundaries like the walls of a floating room. Along the inside edges, more willow poles are woven together, forming a fence that will hold the mud and reeds in place. It's a strange sight. Half construction site, half garden in waiting. Nearby, a boy kneels in a canoe, using a flat-bladed paddle to scoop up thick lake mud and slop it into a woven basket. Each time the basket fills, he hauls it to the edge of the new plot and dumps the black sludge inside the reed mats. The mud spreads and oozes, but the willow fence keeps it from drifting away. Layer after layer, the new ground rises from the water. It's slow work, but the builders move with the kind of steady patience that says they've done this hundreds of times. You notice a curious smell, rich and earthy, almost sweet. The lake mud is alive with nutrients, pulled from centuries of decaying plants and fish. Your guide says the farmers call it tlulmixli, earth mixture, and it's what makes chinampa crops grow so fiercely. Without this black gold, the floating gardens would just be damp rafts. Not all the filler comes from the lake. Another canoe arrives, piled with long green ribbons of algae, wet leaves, and other vegetation pulled from the shallows. This, too, is dumped into the frame, where it will rot and mingle with the mud, feeding the future crops. One man pauses to flick a wriggling water beetle off his hand, then laughs when it lands squarely on his companion's arm. Work here might be hard, but there's still room for jokes. A short way off, a woman in a bright red skirt is tending the edge of an older chinampa. She pushes down new willow cuttings into the soft mud, reinforcing the fence where last season's flood chewed at the base. In time, the cuttings will sprout, their roots tangling into the structure and making it stronger. It strikes you how alive these gardens are, not just metaphorically, but literally. The fences grow, the soil is refreshed, the whole system breathes. Occasionally, a fish splashes in the shallows beside you, disturbed by the constant activity. Overhead, an egret steps gingerly along a half-built section, stabbing its beak into the mud for a snack. Your guide tells you the birds are welcome guests. Their droppings add to the soil's richness, and their sharp eyes help keep pests like grasshoppers in check. At one corner of the new chinampa, someone has already planted a row of quick-growing greens, amaranth leaves maybe, to take advantage of the fresh, wet soil. They'll be ready for market in just a few weeks, long before the maize is even knee-high. You realize this is farming in layers, not just in space, but in time. Short crops, tall crops, year-round cycles, all supported by the same small patch of floating ground. When the last basket of mud is dumped, the workers smooth the surface with their hands, pressing it down until it feels solid underfoot. One man steps onto the new chinampa and tests its spring. It shifts slightly but holds. He grins, satisfied, and gestures to a pile of maize seedlings waiting in a shaded canoe. By sunset, this bare, wet patch will already look like the start of a garden. As your canoe drifts away, you glance back and see the new chinampa floating there, framed by the bright green of its older neighbors. It's hard to imagine that a few days ago, this was just open water. Here, land isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, basket by basket, stake by stake, mud layer by mud layer. And once it's there, it becomes part of the great patchwork of life that keeps this city alive. By mid-morning, the sun has burned away the last wisps of mist, and the water now flashes silver with every ripple. The scene ahead feels almost like a floating marketplace without the stalls, boats moving in all directions, voices carrying across the water, the steady thunk of paddles against wooden hulls. Your canoe slows as the canal narrows again, not because of the banks but because of traffic. A long, flat canoe loaded with pumpkins noses toward you, its bow piled so high with orange and green that you can't see the paddler's face. Behind it, two smaller canoes edge side by side, one filled with freshly cut flowers, the other with bundles of maize stalks tied neatly with twine. A young man leans over the edge to splash his hands in the water, then shakes them dry before picking up his paddle again. From somewhere behind, a sharp whistle sounds. You turn to see a larger cargo canoe, broad, low, and heavily laden, bearing down on the knot of smaller craft. Its owner, an older woman with sun-darkened skin and a woven shawl over her head, calls out for everyone to make way. Slowly, the traffic begins to untangle, each boat angling to give the others room. It's a strange sort of etiquette. No rules written down, yet everyone seems to know when to yield and when to push forward. Along the banks, life continues at its own rhythm. A man sits cross-legged on a low platform, mending the side of his canoe with strips of fresh bark. Nearby, a group of children kneel in the mud, scooping up tiny fish with woven baskets. Every so often, one lets out a triumphant shout and holds up a silvery prize before tossing it into a clay pot half filled with water. The air here smells of wet earth, crushed plants, and wood smoke drifting from a Chinampa kitchen. You catch glimpses of daily life. A woman pounding maize into meal on a flat stone, another hanging bright red chiles to dry along a reed fence, an elderly man in a wide straw hat plucking beans from vines and dropping them into a basket at his side. Your guide points to the flowers again. "Those are for the market, yes," he says, "but not for food. Instead, they'll be used in offerings, festivals, and to decorate the city's temples. Even in the busiest agricultural hub, beauty has its place. The Chinampas are not only the belly of Tenochtitlan, they're part of its soul." Further along, a canoe stacked with firewood drifts into view. The logs are bound with plant fiber, and their ends are blackened, as if they'd been partially burned already. You ask about it, and your guide explains they're charcoal-making logs, destined for the city's cooks and potters. The Chinampas, it seems, are not just for growing crops, but for supplying nearly everything the city needs. Suddenly, the water ahead churns, and a dark, ridged back breaks the surface before slipping away. Your guide chuckles at your startle. "Only a turtle," he says, though sometimes a crocodile comes in from the marshes. He says it casually, but you notice how his eyes scan the water a little more often after that. The traffic thins as the canal widens again, and the sounds of paddles and voices spread out. The flowers' bright colors fade into the distance, replaced by the emerald and gold of the maize fields. You pass a Chinampa where beans have already climbed up the maize stalks, their purple flowers bright against the green. On another, squash vines spill over the edges, their huge leaves shading the soil beneath. Here the gardens are so close together that the canals between them feel like hallways in a vast open-air building. Each plot is different, yet all are part of the same living structure, an immense floating city of food. You realize that even the busiest traffic jams are not chaos at all. They're just the pulse of a system that has fed thousands for generations. By the time the sun slides past its highest point, you've settled into the Chinampa rhythm. The slow pull of the paddle, the gentle sway under your feet, The wave sounds seem to ripple out over the water before vanishing into the reeds. Your guide doesn't talk much now. He just lets you look. Maybe he knows this part doesn't need explanation. The maze towers high here, stalks creaking faintly when the breeze catches them. Between the rows, beans climb and wind themselves in patient spirals, their tendrils grasping like careful hands. Squash sprawls low and wide, its enormous leaves shading the earth so completely you can't see the soil at all. This is the famous Three Sisters method, you're told. Though here the sisters are less like family members and more like the founding members of a neighborhood watch, each keeping the others safe. The maze stands tall, offering its stalks as living ladders for the beans. The beans return the favor by fixing nitrogen in the soil, feeding the maze in return. The squash, broad-leafed and stubborn, keeps the soil cool and damp, while also being a natural anti-weed carpet. You imagine the crops murmuring to one another in the afternoon heat, trading gossip about pests and rainfall. A heron lands on the far side of a chinampa, folding its wings and stepping delicately through the squash vines. It doesn't seem to care that it's in someone's garden. The farmers here know better than to chase away a bird that might eat harmful insects, or at least provide an elegant bit of company. You lean over the side of the canoe and see how the chinampa's edge is built up, layers of mud and plant matter packed and reinforced with woven reeds. A few small fish dart along the water's edge, while tiny frogs cling to the damp stems of plants. You realize you're looking at a self-contained ecosystem. Soil, plants, water, animals, all in balance. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate design or simply the inevitable outcome of generations working in harmony with their environment. Either way, the result is the same. A farming method that doesn't exhaust the land, but renews it. Every now and then you spot something unexpected. A row of amaranth with its deep crimson plumes swaying in the breeze, or a plot of chilies standing in neat ranks, their green fruits flashing bright against the leaves. Your guide says these are rotated in to keep the soil healthy and the diet varied. No monoculture here. If one crop fails, another steps up to fill the basket. As you glide past, you notice a man bent over in the maize rows, pulling up weeds by hand and tossing them into the water. The weeds will drift, break down, and eventually be scooped back onto the chinampa as compost. Nothing is wasted, not even the waste. There's a certain stubborn elegance in that, like a cook who refuses to throw out the potato peels because they know tomorrow's soup will thank them. Further on, the crops change. You pass a chinampa shimmering with green onions, their thin blades trembling in the wind. Another is given over entirely to flowers, bright marigolds that practically glow in the sunlight. Your guide mentions that marigolds are planted near crops not just for their beauty, but because their scent can confuse insect pests. The flowers smile and the bugs get lost. It's a win-win. A sudden splash startles you, and you spot a young boy leaping from a low platform into the canal. He surfaces grinning, holding a dripping bundle of aquatic plants. These, your guide explains, are scooped up to dry and then spread on the chinampa as mulch. Even the weeds of the water are pressed into service here. You're starting to suspect that the chinampas are less like gardens and more like symphonies, each element playing its part, each note tied to the next. If one instrument falters, the music shifts, but the song never truly stops. It's not just about planting seeds and hoping for the best. It's about reading the water, the soil, the air, and adjusting the melody until it hums. The day deepens, and with it comes the slow crawl of heat across your shoulders. The air has thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and flowering squash. Somewhere to your left, someone is laughing, their voice carrying over the water like it's riding a lazy breeze. You glance in that direction and see a farmer crouched on a low raft, scooping muck from the canal with a flat shovel. This, your guide says, is the real work, the quiet, unglamorous heart of Chinampa life. The farmer leans forward, digs deep into the murky water, and heaves a load of dark, silty mud onto the raft. You notice how it glistens under the sun, thick and almost black. That's the good stuff, your guide murmurs. Rich with nutrients, born from a constant cycle of decaying plant matter, fish waste, and microscopic life. The farmer ferries it to his Chinampa's edge, where he scoops it up and spreads it in an even layer. The smell is strong, earthy, but not unpleasant, like a forest floor after rain. This dredging isn't just about feeding the crops. It's also the way the canals are kept open and navigable. Without it, the waterways would choke on silt, turning to mudflats in the dry season. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs planned for this dual-purpose upkeep from the very start, or whether it was just an ingenious byproduct of necessity. Either way, you can see it works. The canals stay clear, the soil stays fertile, and the circle keeps turning. Your guide tells you about the tules and other aquatic plants that grow wild along the water's edge. Farmers sometimes encourage them to thicken, letting their roots weave a living fence that keeps the Chinampa edges from eroding. The cut stalks can be dried for mats, baskets, and even roofing. One plant, 24 uses, because in a place where every square meter matters, you don't let anything go to waste. You pass another worker, this one in a wide straw hat, spreading a mix of waterweed and shredded maize stalks as mulch. The sun beats down, but he moves with the kind of steady pace that says he's not in a hurry. In Chinampa farming, time is measured in seasons, not minutes. The mulch will keep the soil cool, trap moisture, and feed the worms below. You picture them wriggling happily, munching away in the dark. There's a quirky little trick your guide points out. Certain farmers plant sunflowers at the corners of their Chinampas. Not for beauty, though the golden faces are hard to ignore, but because the tall stalks act as windbreaks, shielding more delicate crops from sudden gusts. And when the season ends, the seeds become food, the stalks become fuel, and the cycle begins again. Farther along, you see a man standing in the canal with water up to his knees, tossing a fine net in a lazy arc. It falls, sinks, and is pulled up wriggling with small fish. Some will be eaten fresh, others dried, and a few chopped into the muck for fertilizer. Fish in the soil might sound odd, but it's the same principle you've seen in old fishing villages. Protein for the plants, just as it is for the people. You think about how the Chinampas don't just grow food. They grow relationships between everything in this watery landscape. Plants feed fish. Fish feed plants. Birds keep insects in check. Humans manage the balance. And the canals themselves hum quietly with life. Even the act of dredging mud is a conversation between farmer and earth. You take from one place to feed another, never taking more than the system can give back. At one bend, you spot a small altar tucked under a willow. It's simple. Just a few flowers, a clay figure, and some scattered maize kernels, but it speaks volumes. Your guide explains that offerings are still made here by some farmers, not just for good harvests, but to thank the lake itself. Whether you believe in gods or not, you can't help feeling the quiet reverence in the air. The sun leans lower now, turning the water to molten gold. The workers don't stop. Some are planting seedlings, their hands quick and sure. Others are hauling baskets of green vegetables to small boats, bound for the market. The Chinampa soil, layered, dredged, mulched, holds the heat of the day and the cool of the night, cradling life with the patience of centuries. You sit back and let the rhythm of paddles and shovels fill your ears, wondering if the lake is listening too. The next morning, the Chinampas greet you in mist. The lake's surface is so still that the sky and water trade places, and the thin willow trunks seem to float in midair. You can smell the damp reeds before you see them, their tips heavy with beads of dew. Somewhere far off, a bird calls, a long liquid trill, and your boatman answers with a low hum, as if acknowledging an old friend. Your guide points toward the raised earth ahead, where a line of workers is bent in half, moving slowly down a row. They're planting maize seedlings today. The plants are young but already sturdy, their roots wrapped in moist soil to keep them alive between water and earth. One worker makes a small hole with a pointed stick, another places a seedling, and a third tamps the soil down with practiced care. No shouting, no rush, just a quiet chain of motions repeated again and again. Interspersed between the maize rows are bean seeds, dry and speckled, waiting for the first rains to coax them upward. Squash mounds form soft humps at the edges, their broad leaves to be ready to sprawl across the soil, shading it from the summer sun. The three sisters, your guide whispers, though here the relationship is more than metaphor. Corn grows tall to give beans something to climb. Beans fix nitrogen into the soil for the corn. Squash shades the ground, holding in water. Three crops sharing space, each making the others stronger. It's not just these three. You pass another chinampa, where the farmer has scattered chilies between the maize. Their future red fruits, both a crop and a deterrent to pests. Another bed is full of amaranth. Its leaves for the pot, its seeds for bread. Even medicinal plants have a place here. Epizot for flavoring beans, and a few clumps of chives to keep insects wary. While you drift, a flat-bottomed canoe glides past, its load of green onions neatly stacked and tied with grass. The farmer at the back nods in greeting but doesn't stop paddling. His delivery needs to reach the market before the sun gets too high. You follow him with your eyes until he rounds a bend and vanishes into the mist. Planting season also means repair work. At another chinampa, two young men are reinforcing the willow borders, weaving fresh branches between older ones. The willows, still alive, will root into the water and strengthen the structure. Where gaps have opened, reeds are packed in tight to hold soil until the roots take over. You notice they're careful not to block the small channels between chinampas, where water flows and fish swim. Every barrier is also a gate, every division a connection. The work is both communal and personal. Farmers trade labor, lending hands when someone's planning schedule overruns, but the pride in each chinampa is individual. Your guide says you can tell a lot about a person by their chinampa's edges. Neat and squared means meticulous. Wilder borders hint at someone who trusts nature to do part of the work. By mid-morning, the mist has burned away, and the air hums with insect life. Dragonflies hover over the canals, their wings catching sunlight like glass. A frog leaps from a reed into the water with a soft plop. You hear the swish of a paddle before you see it. A canoe piled high with marigolds. They glow like captured sunlight, bound for offerings in temples and homes. Flowers are as much a crop here as maize or beans, a reminder that chinampas feed the spirit as well as the stomach. Your guide steers you toward a narrower canal, where smaller chinampas sit almost touching. This is where families keep their kitchen plots, small, intensely cultivated beds for herbs, peppers, greens, and whatever else might find its way into the evening meal. You catch the scent of cilantro as you pass, sharp and fresh. In the distance, the city of Tenochtitlan rises like a mirage, its temples and causeways glowing faintly in the heat. From here, it's easy to forget that this green, fertile maze is man-made, stitched into the lake by human hands, and held together by centuries of habit. The chinampas don't just support the city, they are the city's heartbeat, steady and unbroken, season after season. By the time you head back, the planting rows are longer, greener, more alive than they were at dawn. And in a week, they'll be different again. The chinampas never sleep. They only change clothes. The air smells different now, richer, sharper. Your guide tells you it's because the farmers are feeding the earth. You watch as two men kneel at the water's edge, scooping thick black silt from the lake bed with flat wooden paddles. Each scoop is heavy, dripping and glistens in the morning light. The muck smells faintly of fish and rotting plants, but underneath is a sweetness, the scent of fertile decay. This is tlekitl, lake mud, and it is the beating heart of the Chinampa's productivity. It's hard work. One man hauls the dripping paddle up, lets it slide into a woven basket balanced in the canoe, then dips it back into the water. Another pushes the boat along slowly, keeping it steady so the mud collectors can work without tipping over. You can see their arms straining under the weight, the muscles moving in long, deliberate arcs. Each basket is rowed to the Chinampa and upended along the planting rows, the mud oozing into place. The process feels ancient and cyclical. The lake gives nutrients to the crops feed the city, and the city's waste, organic matter, plant scraps, even the remnants from the markets, returns to the water, where it becomes mud again. Nothing is wasted. The Chinampa is not just a plot of land. It's an ecosystem that breathes with the lake. Nearby, another group is using a different method. Instead of scooping mud from open water, they work in the shallows, pulling up mats of algae and aquatic plants. These green tangles are dragged to the Chinampa edges and layered under soil as mulch. In the heat, they will rot down into rich humus, keeping the beds moist and feeding the roots. You catch the faint odor, pungent but somehow fresh, of wet vegetation breaking down. And then there is the more daring method. Your guide grins as he gestures to a boy in a canoe holding a pole tipped with a clay jar. He dips it into the water near a nesting platform where water birds have gathered. When the jar comes up, it's not just mud. It's a slurry flecked with white. Bird droppings. The farmers know it's potent, packed with nutrients, and they treat it like treasure. The boy pours the mix carefully into the shallow furrows between maize rows, where water can carry it straight to the roots. Your guide explains that each farmer has their own recipe for soil enrichment. Some swear by pure lake mud, others by alternating mud and mulch, still others by mixing in ash from burned plant matter. But the principle is always the same. Feed the soil, and the soil feeds you. On another Chinampa, you see an older man spreading crushed shells over a bed of beans. They crunch under his bare feet as he walks, scattering them with a flick of the wrist. The shells come from the lake's snails and clams, and over time they break down, adding minerals to the soil. The man notices you watching and offers a few shells for you to feel. Light, almost powdery at the edges. He grins, showing teeth worn down like the shells themselves. Everywhere you look, the lake and the land are intertwined. The canals are not just highways for boats. They are reservoirs, storage for water in dry times, and sinks for nutrients that will cycle back into the Chinampas. Your guide says that when the Spanish arrived, they marveled at the fertility here. 2, sometimes 3 harvests a year from the same plot, without exhausting the soil. But the truth is, it wasn't magic. It was mud. As the sun climbs, the mud haulers finish their work and drift toward the market with their now empty baskets. The air smells less of lake and more of growing things. Beans curling toward the sky, squash leaves spreading wide, chilies beginning to show tiny white flowers. The Chinampa breathes in the light and exhales green. By the time you leave, you realize the farmers have barely looked at you. Not out of rudeness, but because they are part of a rhythm you can't interrupt. Mud, water, roots, leaves. The Chinampas don't ask for attention. They simply work and expect you to do the same. You wake the next morning to a chorus of sounds that ripple across the Chinampa landscape. Low croaks of frogs hidden in the reeds, the splash of a paddle somewhere in the canal, and the distant hum of human voices already deep into their morning work. You step outside the reed-walled shelter you've been allowed to sleep in, and your bare feet meet the cool, damp earth. The air carries the scent of green leaves and wet soil, a perfume that's half garden, half lake. The crops are already stirring in the early light. Rows of maize stand like green sentinels, their tassels catching the sun. Between them, beans snake upward, their vines wrapping around the sturdy corn stalks in a lazy spiral. On the ground, squash plants spread their wide, prickly leaves like living umbrellas, shading the soil and locking in moisture. You notice how intentional it all feels, each plant placed not just for its own sake, but for how it will help its neighbors. This is the milpa system, your guide explains as you walk. It's an agricultural trio: corn for carbohydrates, beans for protein and nitrogen fixing, squash for weed suppression, and soil moisture. The combination has been feeding Mesoamerica for centuries. It's efficient, it's sustainable, and as your guide notes with a smile, it's tasty when you roast the squash seeds and boil the beans with chili. The farmers here tend their crops with a kind of patient choreography. One woman moves slowly down a row, stooping to pinch off a damaged leaf. Another checks the base of a maize stalk, pushing a little more lake mud around its roots. A young boy follows with a clay jar of water, dribbling just enough to darken the soil. There is no rush, no frantic shouting, just steady work that fits the pace of the sun. Not every chinampa grows food, though. You pass one planted with bright marigolds, their orange heads nodding in the breeze. They're not for decoration, at least not entirely. The flowers repel certain pests, and their petals will later be used in ceremonies. Another chinampa is thick with amaranth, a grain prized for its high protein. Your guide points out its deep magenta flowers and says it's not just food. Amaranth is part of rituals, offerings, and feasts. A plant for the body and the gods, he says. As you watch, a farmer scoops a handful of dirt and lets it run through his fingers. He's checking its texture, feeling if it's moist enough, if the fine silt is balanced with organic matter. Historians still argue whether Aztec farmers had a formal understanding of soil science, or if their methods evolved purely through trial and error. Either way, standing here, you can see the results: crops that stand taller than your shoulders and leaves so glossy they almost look lacquered. Every so often, your guide pauses to let you notice the sounds. A buzz of insects hovers over the bean flowers, pollinators at work. The soft cluck of ducks drifts from a nearby canal, where they paddle lazily between the reeds. You hear a splash and catch sight of a man standing waist-deep in water, pulling weeds from the canal floor, not for cleaning, but because those weeds will be dried and turned into mulch. Even the act of removing plants from the water becomes part of the cycle of feeding the land. By midday, the work shifts slightly. The sun is stronger now, so the farmers focus on lighter tasks, checking for insect damage, weaving new reed mats for canal edges, repairing worn-out tools. You sit in the shade with a group of elders who peel roasted chilies and talk quietly about the weather. They predict rain by the color of the morning sky and the behavior of certain birds. You wonder how many of their forecasts have proven right over the years. A quirky moment interrupts the calm. A boy runs past carrying what looks like a giant frog, its legs kicking in protest. He plops it into a shallow basin near the maize field. Your guide chuckles and explains it's not for eating. Frogs are part of the chinampa's ecosystem, helping control insects. This one had wandered too far from its pond and was simply getting a lift home. By late afternoon, the light softens again. The farmers return to heavier work, pulling up algae from the canals, hauling baskets of harvested beans, or cutting armfuls of maize leaves to feed their ducks. You help carry a basket once, the weight pulling your arms down. The farmer laughs kindly at your effort, saying it took him years before he could carry two at a time. As the sun drops lower, you notice how the chinampas seem to glow. The green of the leaves deepens. The water catches the orange of the sky, and the air cools enough that you feel a slight shiver. Work slows. Tools are stacked neatly. Baskets are covered with mats to protect from dew, and the farmers drift toward home by canoe. You stand for a while on the edge of a plot, feeling the faint tremor of life in the soil beneath your feet. The roots are still drinking. The worms are still tunneling. The tiny micro-world in the mud is still moving. And you realize this, more than the plants, more than the careful planting, is the secret to the Chinampas. They never truly rest. They live on, quietly working, even after the humans have gone home. The next day begins differently, not with quiet morning work, but with the sound of oars slapping the water in quick rhythm. From your shelter, you see boats arriving, some piled with clay jars, others with woven baskets, still others carrying long poles stacked neatly like bundles of reeds. Your guide waves you over and tells you it's a maintenance day, a time when several families join forces to repair and strengthen the Chinampas before the rainy season arrives. The rainy months, he explains, can turn the calm canals into churning lanes of brown water, rising high enough to threaten the edges of the fields. If a Chinampa isn't secured well, it can erode, break apart, or even drift slightly, losing precious crops in the process. So today, everyone works with urgency. You climb into a canoe with two farmers and head toward the far edge of the plot. One man uses his pole to push against the soft bottom, guiding the boat toward a stretch of embankment where willow poles are stacked nearby. These aren't just any poles. They are cut from young willows that will still sprout roots when placed in the soil. Once anchored in the mud along the edge, they'll grow into living walls, binding the earth together over years. The work is muddy, slow, and strangely satisfying. A group of men and women hammer the willow poles into place with heavy stone mallets, their strikes making a deep thunk as each one bites into the mud. Others shovel layers of lake silt and rotting vegetation behind the poles, building up the bank like a dam. You're handed a shovel and try your best to mimic their practice movements. By the time you've filled a single section, two farmers have already finished 3. Along another section, workers weave reed mats between poles. These mats aren't as permanent as living willows, but they can be put up quickly to hold back erosion until the willow roots take over. You notice the reeds are damp and pliable, bending easily under the farmer's hands. When finished, the mat wall has a subtle pattern, diagonal lines crossing like the skin of a fish. Midway through the morning, a canoe pulls up with a delivery of fresh silt from the lake bottom. The farmer explains that this is nutrient renewal, a process that keeps Chinampa soil endlessly fertile. They scoop mud with a wide, flat shovel, flipping it into woven baskets. Once on the Chinampa, the mud is spread in a thin layer over the surface, sealing in moisture and replenishing minerals. You can see the difference. The older soil is lighter in color, while the fresh mud is dark, almost black, and smells faintly of algae. The community's teamwork extends beyond construction. While the embankments are reinforced, others patrol the canals for floating debris, broken branches, invasive plants, or the occasional unlucky fish trapped in reed tangles. Children are given smaller tasks, gathering dry twigs for cooking fires, fetching clay jars of drinking water, and delivering messages between work crews. At midday, the work pauses for a communal meal. Mats are unrolled on the grass and baskets open to reveal piles of tamales, roasted squash slices, and steaming beans flavored with epizot. Someone passes you a small clay cup of pulque, a fermented maguey drink that is cloudy and slightly sour. It's refreshing after the heat, though it leaves a faint buzz in your head. The conversation during lunch is lively. Farmers swap stories of the best harvests, argue over whether to plant more chilies next season, and joke about the lazy chinampa at the far end of the canal that always seems to produce smaller maize. An elder says it's not lazy, just in need of better water flow, and a plan is made to widen its irrigation channel. When the break ends, you move to another team's worksite and watch as they repair a sluice gate, a simple wooden barrier that controls water flow between canals. The gate is lifted, allowing a rush of water to fill one section, then lowered again with a heavy thud. The farmers time this so that each chinampa gets just enough water without flooding. It's like a living, breathing irrigation map, adjusted daily by hand. By late afternoon, the edges of the chinampa look renewed. Fresh poles stand upright. The reed mats gleam with dampness, and the air smells of newly turned mud. Your hands are stained brown and your shoulders ache, but the satisfaction of seeing the transformation outweighs the fatigue. The rains arrive not with a gentle drizzle, but with a sudden rolling wall of sound. Fat drops striking the canal like drum beats, rippling surface until it seems the whole lake is shivering. You've been told that the rainy season is both a blessing and a threat. The chinampas depend on this cycle, the steady rise and fall of water levels, but too much rain can undo weeks of work in a single night. Your host, Xochitl, pulls you into her canoe before dawn, the clouds still heavy with last night's storm. She wants you to see how the farmers manage floods in real time. You paddle toward the far edge of the chinampa zone, where the lake meets a wide barrier made of stone and stakes. The Albaradon, a defensive wall that keeps the open lake from surging into the canals all at once. Beyond the wall, the water churns with the force of the incoming storm runoff. The gates are half lowered, allowing only a narrow stream to trickle into the canal system. A group of men balance on the slippery stones, adjusting the gates, their hair plastered to their foreheads by the rain. Once inside the protected zone, the water still runs high. Some canals have risen enough to lap against the edges of the chinampas, threatening to spill over. Xochitl steers you toward a drainage crew who are digging temporary channels from flooded plots back into deeper canals. The work is muddy chaos, barefoot men and women standing knee-deep in swirling water, using wide shovels to scoop mud. Their movements quick and practiced. You help bail out a small plot where young maize plants are nearly submerged. A woman explains that even a day of standing water can rot the roots. She scoops water with a gourd, tossing it into the canal, while her son clears clumps of floating debris from the plants. You can smell the sharp scent of wet soil mixed with crushed leaves. In other areas, sluice gates are being opened to divert excess water to lower-lying sections, using the chinampa network like a giant, hand-controlled drainage machine. It's astonishing how coordinated it all is. Signals shouted from one canal to another, poles raised and lowered like semaphore flags to show whether gates are open or shut. Not all water is unwanted, though. Xochitl takes you to a plot where workers have built small clay berms to trap just the right amount of water for a late planting of amaranth. They explain that the fine seeds need a moist surface to germinate, and the rainwater, mixed with nutrients from the lake, acts like a natural fertilizer. Here, farmers lean on their poles, smiling despite the weather, knowing the storm has given them a head start. By midday, the heaviest rain has passed. The clouds thin, breaking into strips of blue sky, and the air turns warm and heavy with the smell of wet vegetation. You notice something. In this watery world, storms don't bring stillness. They bring movement. Canoes dart up and down the canals like messengers. People call to each other across the water. Gates are opened and shut in rapid sequence. It feels less like surviving a flood, and more like conducting an orchestra. The whole chinampa system responding as one. Later, when the emergency work is done, Xochitl takes you to a quiet stretch of canal, where the rainwater runs clear. The surface mirrors the sky, broken only by the silver flash of fish darting below. "This is why the gardens live," she says, tapping the water with her paddle. "The rain brings the lake brings the silt brings the plants. And the people," she smiles, "the people keep it from turning wild." That night, the chinampas feel transformed. The willows glisten, the soil is dark and heavy, and the canals run full but calm. Somewhere in the distance, a frog begins to sing, and soon dozens join in, their chorus echoing over the water. You lie back in the canoe, rocking gently, realizing that in this place, even a storm is part of the rhythm. By now you've seen the chinampas in every kind of light. Misty dawns, hot midday glare, the gold of evening, and even the silver wash of moonlight. But tonight, Xochitl has one last thing to show you before you leave. You paddle slowly through a canal lit only by a few flickering torches set into the muddy banks. Their reflections stretch and tremble on the water, making it look like the whole surface is alive. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and somewhere nearby, a drum taps a slow, steady rhythm. You round a bend, and there it is, a night harvest. In the glow of torches, men and women wade knee-deep into the water to pull up ahuejote roots, the same willows that stabilize the chinampas. Others stand in canoes, scooping up mats of aquatic plants to pile on the gardens as mulch. The work is quieter than daytime labor. Voices low, movements unhurried. It feels more like a ritual than a chore. One man beckons you over to watch him haul up a basket of axolotls, their feathery gills swaying as they blink in the torchlight. He explains they're both food and good luck symbols, kept in certain canals that are protected from predators. Historians still argue whether axolotls were deliberately farmed in these waters or simply flourished because of the stable, clean environment. Either way, they've been part of chinampa life for centuries. You help carry a load of fresh mud to one plot. The soil is cool against your palms, rich and heavy, smelling faintly of algae. A woman sprinkles it around young bean plants, explaining that nighttime application keeps the moisture in, so the plants wake up with their breakfast ready. It's not exactly a scientific term, but you like it better than nitrogen enrichment. As you work, the drumbeat grows softer, replaced by the gentle splash of paddles heading home. Overhead, the stars are brighter than you've seen in weeks, the Milky Way spilling across the sky like sifted flour. You realize that out here, far from city lamps, the night has a different weight. Thicker, slower, stretching time until it barely moves. When the last baskets are emptied and the torches doused, you and Xochitl drift back along the canal. The water is still high from yesterday's storm, but it moves like glass now. You think of how this entire system, mud, roots, poles, sluices, willows, people, works in a loop, season after season. It's a collaboration so seamless that even the rain seems like a willing partner. She ties up the canoe, and you both sit in silence for a long moment. The smell of damp earth rises. Frogs sing in uneven rhythms, and somewhere far off, a coyote yips. Your hands are still gritty with silt, but it feels like the kind of dirt you want to keep under your nails for a while. Proof you've been part of something older and slower than the world you'll return to. The chinampas will still be here in the morning, waiting for another day of care, another round of patient adjustments, another reason to marvel at how much life can grow when people decide to work with the water instead of against it. The night deepens, the air cooling enough that your breath leaves faint trails in the torchless dark. The willows, their trunks slick from the storm, sway just enough to ripple the starlight on the canal. Somewhere in that shifting reflection is the memory of rain, of paddles cutting through high water, of voices calling across a wet and waking city. You let your shoulders sink, noticing the way the sounds fade into one another. The slow lapping of water against the bank, the soft, irregular chorus of frogs, the faint hum of night insects tracing lazy loops in the air. Even the occasional splash from a fish feels unhurried, like it knows the moon will be up for hours yet. In the quiet, you picture the chinampas sleeping too, not in stillness, but in the slow, steady breathing of roots taking in water, of soil cooling under the open sky. Somewhere, a gate creaks as it shifts with the current. Somewhere else, the last of the storm's runoff trickles into a deeper canal. Your eyes grow heavier with each sound, each faint movement in the dark. The work here never stops, but it also never hurries. Every change is met with patience, every season with quiet readiness. It's a reminder, soft as the hum of the lake, that even the most intricate systems can rest without breaking. You take a long, slow breath, the air tasting faintly of damp leaves, and let it out in time with the rhythm of the water against the canoe. The night holds you there, gently, as if it understands you've had enough motion for one day. Somewhere between the rustle of willow leaves and the silver gleam of the stars, your thoughts begin to drift, lighter and slower, until they dissolve into the stillness.